Welcome all PCU members. In this lesson, I'd like to tell you about different situations when you're in the fortunate position having a queen versus an opponent's pawn. Now, normally speaking, that's a humongous advantage. However, in case that your opponent's pawn is far advanced and is only a square or two away from the promotion square, you have a danger that if that pawn gets to promote, the game will end in a draw. So let's talk about these type of positions. Here we go. This is our first position, and as you can see, the black pawn is only one square away from becoming a queen. Now, white has numerous ways to win here. However, what I'd like you to remember is that in such endgames, when your king is far away, not ready to catch that passed pawn, the simplest and most ideal way to win is to try to position your queen right on that square d1 in front of that black pawn on d2. If the white queen succeeds to get to d1, after that you can simply walk with your king towards the black pawn, and once there are two attackers on the pawn, the king and the queen, the black king alone is helpless in protecting it successfully. So let's see how this works in practice. White would play queen h5 check. As I said, white has numerous ways to win, but this is by far the clearest and easiest way. Doesn't matter to which square the black king moves to, for example, moving to f2, trying to follow up by moving the king to e1 and then promoting the pawn. Black will not be given the time to do that because white now has the momentum and has the opportunity to move the queen to d1 under the pawn, attacking the pawn right away. Black, let's say, protects the pawn, and then the king is simply moving closer and closer. Black has no active plan. All black can do is try to hang on to that pawn as long as they can, and then the king just keeps coming closer and closer, and then basically squeezing the black king out of the way. And as in so many situations, especially in endgames in chess, one of the problems the weaker side usually has that they cannot say they pass. They must make a move whenever it's their turn. Unlike in some other board games where you can simply skip your turn, not in chess. The black king must move, and then the white king got real close, also targeting the black pawn, and then on the following move, the queen will just capture the pawn safely. Let's compare this to our next example. Well, it's very, very similar. White still has a queen, black still has a pawn, in fact, on exactly the same place on d2. The white king is also far away in the same corner as it was in the previous position. However, there is one major difference, and that is that the black king right now is right next to its own pawn. In fact, it is supporting it and is trying to promote it on the following move. If it were black's turn, black indeed would advance that pawn and promote it to a queen, and the game's likely outcome would be a draw. And now the white queen has no way in getting to that magical d1 square to block that pawn for once and for all. So, how can white still win this game? The challenge is that if we would like to bring the king to help, it's too slow because black would get the time to advance the pawn and promote it to a queen. Now, here is the trick that you need to remember. And Generally in chess, it's a lot more important to remember ideas and patterns than specific moves or positions. And this is one of those many situations when you need to remember the pattern. And listen well. The pattern is white needs to force the black king to that very d1 square. Because what happens if the black king will need to move in front of its own pawn to d1? What happens is the white king will be free to come closer to the black pawn. Because at the moment when the black king is in front of its own pawn, the pawn is not threatening to get promoted. Okay, let's see how this works again in practice. White, first of all, needs to bring his own queen closer. That's the only way to force the black king to that d1 square. Of course, black is not quite literally forced to move there, only if they want to make sure they don't lose that pawn. But after all, the ultimate goal of white is to win that pawn. So that's not really a good alternative for black anyway. Okay, so white can start with giving checks. There are various checks that may work. However, the point is we want to bring the queen somewhere around these squares closer to the black pawn, and you'll see very soon why. Let's say the black king moves to f2, and now white can get closer, kind of moving up the ladder, either by giving checks on the f file, on f6, or moving simply behind the pawn. Because if the pawn now advances, the king does not protect the d1 square, and the white queen would simply capture the newborn queen after pawn promotes, queen captures, and of course black did not accomplish anything. So black better just comes back and protects that pawn on d2, and also again threatens to advance the pawn and promote it to a queen. So again, the white king does not have the time to come closer to assist the queen. And again, kind of climbing the ladder, the white queen is inching closer and closer physically to the black pawn. Black is in a check. The black king needs to move. The pawn doesn't have time to get promoted. The king, of course, will not voluntarily go in front of the pawn, in which case the white king could start getting closer. So let's say the black king moves to f2 again, and white gives the check on d4. Now, in addition to checking the black king, white is also attacking the pawn on d2. So the black king better moves again to the e file, protecting that pawn, and again renewing the threat of trying to advance the pawn so the pawn can become a queen. And one more check on e4, and the king again moves to f2, and now finally we accomplished our goal, moving the queen right behind the pawn. Now the black king no longer can move back to e2, however it can still move to e1 with the same ideas, protecting the pawn and supporting its goal in trying to get promoted. And now comes the key moment when the white queen gives the check on e3. And now black faces a sad choice. Either the king would go to f1 when the pawn falls immediately, or the king indeed needs to finally move in front of the pawn. Well, of course, that's still the better choice than losing the pawn right away. However, this gives white the opportunity to finally bring the king to help. But now the black king can move out again and start this whole challenge again in trying to promote the pawn. Now white needs to accomplish the same on the other side with checks on the other side, and with doing that, forcing the black king back again to d1, and then the king will get a moment again to come closer to the black pawn. The way to achieve that is to simply pin the pawn. White could check also and do exactly the same as we did before, but I would like to show you a different method, which in fact in this case is even faster, achieving the goal in a faster way than giving the checks. Now the pawn cannot advance because the pawn is pinned, and that would leave, by moving the pawn forward, would leave the king in attack, and that's not allowed by the rules. So the most logical response here for black is to move the king to c1, to again get out of the pin and renew the threat of trying to advance the pawn. And now we're giving a check from c4, king b2, and we're behind the pawn again on d3. Attacking it, black better goes to c1, protecting it, and here comes the check on c3. Now again, black has the set choice of moving away from the pawn and giving it up, or moving it to d1, trying to hang on to it. But this gives white again the time to get closer, and the king can move to f6. Now the king can move to the other side. By the way, if the king would move to e1, then the white king would be free to get even closer, because right now the black pawn again is pinned. It's not able to move forward, even if it were black's turn a second time. So king e2 is a better choice, and now white needs to do again the same operation. Pin the pawn. If the king would move up to e3, the queen would occupy the key promotion square, and then of course the win would be rather simple. So black's best choice here is to move the king to e1, and now again comes the check, forcing the king to f2, moving behind the pawn. See, we're getting the same pattern over and over until we force the king under the pawn again, giving white the time to get the king closer. King moves again to c2, and the move is, by now, I think you know it as well, it is pinning the pawn by playing queen e2, and the check from the other side, and moving to the key d3 square behind the pawn, forcing the king to c1, and then to d1, right under the pawn, and now the king is real close. After king e2, white now has numerous ways to win. The simplest is to check on e3, right away forcing it back to d1, and then the white king is already sufficiently close by coming to d3, and on the following move the queen will simply capture the pawn. A very important endgame. As you can see, it was 25 moves. In fact, it will be the 26th move when white succeeds to capture the pawn. However, if you pay attention to the pattern, it's not that complicated. By the way, this very same method would exist if you would have the same participants, a white king and queen versus a black king, and it could be a pawn on the b file, e file, or g file. The method of winning would be identical. So what you need to remember is not the moves, but the ideas. The idea is that you would need your king to be close, so the king could help in capturing the pawn, in supporting the queen. And the only way you can accomplish that, if you're able to force your opponent's king, the weaker side's king in this case, to be in front of the pawn, blocking its own pawn's advancement. Well, I hope you remember these ideas during your games. And now let's see some exceptions. Let's talk about a position when black has a c or f pawn, or we could call them bishop pawns, because remember, the pawns on the c and f files are the ones that start the game in front of the bishop. Now, how is this different than having a pawn on D file, on E file, G or B file, as I mentioned a minute ago? Well, let me show you how. Let's say white tries the same exact method of inching closer to the pawn and trying to force the black king in front of its own pawn and then bring the king closer. Well, this is the critical moment. That when finally the white queen inched up, and normally this is the situation when if the king doesn't want to give up on its pawn, we'll move to c1 in front of the pawn, giving white the time to come closer with the king. Because of the special situation that the king can move to the corner. And remember, it's because the king is in a corner, being limited by the edges of the board. That creates a special situation. That even if white captures the pawn, the game ends in a draw. In fact, the game ends in a draw immediately because this position is stalemate. That's one of the most important things that you need to pay attention to in endgames when you have a queen and your opponent doesn't have pieces or has maybe only one other piece left, because it's very easy to accidentally make stalemate. And remember, when you're ahead in the game, you don't want that to happen, because when the game ends in a stalemate, that means the game ends in a draw, the game ends in a tie, and both you and your opponent would get half a point each. On the other hand, on the other side, if you're in a bad position, you're the one behind material, that's one of the escape opportunities. So if time to time you're in a difficult situation, stalemate may save you. Let's see another situation where black has not a bishop pawn but a rook pawn. We call rook pawns when a pawn is on a A or H files. In this position again, black is hoping to promote his own pawn. The catch is that at the moment it's white's turn. So let's see what's the challenge here. White, let's say, moves up by giving checks or attacking the pawn like we saw in our second example. And here again, the challenge is that after the check, when the king moves to the corner, even though the king is in the corner, again, because of a stalemate idea, the white king does not have the time to get closer. Because if in this moment the white king moves to g7, again, game is over by stalemate. Now let's see some exceptions when even though black has a rook pawn, the game is still a win. The only way that can happen if your king is much, much closer already, like in this position. So if the king is at least as close as it is on d5, or of course if it's even closer like c4, b4, a4, d3, d4, d2, d1, and even squares like e4, e3, and so on, a number of other squares. In fact, I highlight for you all the squares that would still give white a win. If the white king would be on any of those highlighted green squares, the game would be a win. But how? Let me show you. Well, it's quite amazing, but in this case, white can win even after black gets to promote their pawn. And the way that happens is white gives a check. Now, if the king doesn't move next to the pawn on b1, but for example moves to b3, then we're back to the idea that we discussed in the very first position of this lesson. The queen can easily get to the diagonal on g7, and then black cannot prevent the queen coming to a1 and occupying the square in front of the pawn. And then the win is quite simple. But what happens if indeed the black king goes to b1? And then it's quite amazing that white can afford to simply move the king closer and allow the black pawn to get promoted. Because after king b3, the black king is cornered, kind of. White is threatening to checkmate by giving a check somewhere along the first rank. In fact, at this moment, there is a threat even to checkmate with queen c2. And even though it's black's turn, the black queen is free to move anywhere it can, but none of them will actually solve the problem of defending against all the threats. For example, moving the queen to d4 would guard against the check on g1, but would certainly not guard against a check on f1, after which black would only delay checkmate by one move, blocking the check, and queen takes queen would end the game. Let's see another example. In this case, even though black has a far advanced rook pawn with the king close enough to be able to protect it, black is still losing. And the reason is that black has an extra pawn on the other side of the board. Usually, we are very happy when we have more pieces than less. This is one of those exceptions when black wishes he would not have that second pawn on a3. And the whole reason why, in this case, that's a piece we wish we wouldn't have, at least as black, because the stalemate idea will no longer exist. So, in practice, the way it works, white would, let's say, play queen h3, going behind the pawn, attacking it. The black king comes to protect it. Queen g3, king h1, and now white can play queen f2. Because it's not a stalemate, black can move his pawn on the other side. Remember, unlike some beginners think that stalemate is about the king not being able to move. Remember, when we talk about stalemate, it's not only about a king, it's also about the king or any of the other pieces. So if even one little pawn is able to move, the position is not stalemate. And in fact, after white's next move, it is checkmate and not stalemate. So white is winning. And finally, let's see two little pawn endgames that will show you the relevance of these type of endgames that can arise from some simple pawn endgames. In this position, if it's white's turn, white can win. Why? Because white advances the pawn. It's a pawn race. They both are advancing. And white is able to promote the pawn to a queen first with a check. It's very important that it's a check. And therefore, black does not have the time to promote his own pawn. The king needs to get out of the check, and then the already discussed method will win the game for white, because it's a center pawn, and with center pawns or knight pawns, the win is always available. Doesn't matter how far the white king is. And our very last example, here we go. In this position, it's black's turn. Can you figure out if can black win, or is it a draw, or is white winning? Take your time and then come back and listen to the answer. And the answer is black is winning, because after both pawns keep advancing. Even though white has a bishop pawn, which would be a draw if the white king, for example, would be on b7 or b8. Here it's not, because the black queen is safely able to get to the promotion square. We are going to f5 or even h3, and then the following move, queen c8, and then nothing can stop the black king from getting closer and closer, and then simply winning the pawn and later the game. Well, I hope you paid attention to this important lesson and remember this, and it can make a difference between winning or drawing a game, or in some cases, if you're on the weaker side of the position, drawing instead of losing. Well, good luck using this pattern, and see you next week. Bye-bye.